Combat sports are not primarily about violence. They are about behavior under constraint. That's the main argument Dr. Hudson Golino, from the University of Virginia, makes in his new book titled The Psychology of Combat Sports. That sounds strange at first, because when people look at boxing, judo, wrestling, mixed martial arts, or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the first thing they see is contact. The most interesting part is this. Combat sports create a situation where your body is under stress, your emotions are activated, your attention is being pulled in multiple directions, and another person is actively trying to disrupt every decision you make. And somehow inside that pressure, you still have to perceive, decide, and act. That is why combat sports are one of the best laboratories for studying human psychology.
In this video, we want to explain the science and psychology of combat sports from a different angle. Not from the cliché angle of toughness, not from the simplistic idea that martial arts make people aggressive, and not from the motivational speaker version of discipline and confidence. We want to look at combat sports as dynamic psychological systems. A fight or a sparring round is not just a physical exchange. It is a moving system made of physiological regulation, emotional control, attention, perception, action, and social meaning. And because everything is changing in real time, combat sports reveal something very important about psychology. Many of the things psychologists study cannot be understood with a single measurement. A single survey is a photograph. But emotion, stress, fear, aggression, pain tolerance, and confidence are not photographs. They are movies. So today we want to explain why combat sports require a science of movies, not snapshots.
When students first encounter combat sports through psychology, they often expect the topic to be aggression, fear, anger, or toughness. And yes, those things matter, but the foundation is constraint. In combat sports, the athlete operates inside a tightly bounded system. There are rules. There is limited space. There is time pressure. There is fatigue. There is pain. There is uncertainty. And most importantly, there is another person who is not cooperating with your plan. This makes combat sports very different from many forms of exercise. If you are lifting weights, the barbell does not fake a movement. It does not change strategy. It does not punish you for overcommitting. It does not read your breathing and adjust. But an opponent does. In combat sports, every action happens inside an interaction. You are not just moving. You are moving in relation to another intelligent, adaptive system. That is why perception and action cannot be separated. You do not first perceive, then think for a while, then act. You perceive while acting. You act while perceiving. Your opponent changes while you are changing, and all of this happens under stress. This is what makes combat sports psychologically rich. The athlete does not have time to plan long, abstract sequences. What matters is whether the athlete can detect relevant information and act on it while physiological arousal is high. And this is why the psychology of combat sports cannot be reduced to personality traits like confidence or toughness. Those labels describe something, but they do not explain the process. The real scientific questions are more specific. How does arousal change perception? How does fear narrow attention? How does pain affect decision-making? How does training change emotional regulation? How does an athlete learn to read another person's intentions before the movement fully happens? Those are process questions, and process questions require dynamic science. Before looking at combat sports research, it helps to ask a deeper question. What makes something easy or hard to study scientifically? At first, people often think that things closer to us are easier to study. For example, which seems easier to study, a distant galaxy or microbiology? Most people would say microbiology, because cells are closer to us than galaxies. But that is not always true. A galaxy is extremely far away, but over the timescale of seconds, minutes, or even hours, it is relatively stable. You can point a telescope at a part of the sky and collect light. The object is not changing shape second by second in a way that ruins the measurement. In that sense, the galaxy is very far away, but it is temporally stable. Now compare that to a cell. A cell is close, but it is incredibly busy. Proteins move, chemical reactions happen, structures change, signals appear and disappear. The thing you are trying to measure might change before your instrument has finished measuring it. So the cell is closer, but in some ways harder to study. Why? Because the timescale is faster. This matters for psychology. People often think emotions are easy to study because everyone has them. But emotions are like the cell, not like the galaxy. They are close to us, but they change rapidly. You can ask someone how they feel right now, and the answer may be accurate for that moment. But what about 5 minutes later? What about after a hard round? What about after being submitted by someone they expected to beat? What about later that night when they are lying in bed replaying the mistake? The emotional state has a rhythm. If your measurement does not match the rhythm of the phenomenon, you miss the phenomenon. That is one of the most important ideas in this whole video. This brings us to one of the biggest problems in combat sports research, the snapshot problem. Most studies in sports psychology collect data at a few moments. Before competition, after competition, before training, after training. Sometimes that is useful. But if you have any experience with training, you know that the psychological story is much more complex than that. Imagine this. You go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, you train hard, you roll with someone you expected to handle easily, maybe a white belt, maybe someone smaller, maybe someone less experienced, and they tap you, not with something beautiful, not with some brilliant technical sequence. You just made a mistake. You leave class, you go home, you try to sleep, but you cannot stop thinking about it. Why did I do that? I should have known better. I cannot believe I got caught there. And now the most important psychological event of the day might not be what happened during class. It might be what happens later, alone, in bed at 2 a.m. If a study measured only before training and after training, it would miss that whole process. It would miss the moment when the athlete either turns the mistake into learning or turns it into self-criticism. That is a failure of ecological observability. The real psychological process is happening in the in-between spaces. And this is not just a technical measurement problem, it is a conceptual problem. Psychology started as a science of individuals. The early question was, how does the individual mind work? But over time, psychology became increasingly focused on populations. How do people, on average, behave? What is the average difference between athletes and non-athletes? Those questions matter, but they do not answer the question of how a specific person changes over time. Studying 100 fighters at one time is not the same as studying one fighter at 100 times. That difference is crucial.
There is a technical word for this problem, non-ergodicity. I know that sounds abstract, but the idea is simple. The variation between people is not necessarily the same as the variation within a person. Let me say that differently. If one athlete is generally more anxious than another athlete, that does not tell us how anxiety changes inside one athlete from moment to moment. Between-person differences and within-person dynamics are not the same thing. Here is a simple example. Suppose a study finds that athletes who report more anger before competition are more likely to win. That is a between-person finding, but it does not automatically mean that if you, personally, increase your anger before competition, your performance will improve. For one athlete, a little anger may sharpen attention. For another, it may cause emotional flooding and fatigue. The group average does not necessarily describe the individual process. This is one of the reasons combat sports are so useful for psychology. They make this problem visible. In combat sports, the same label can mean different processes. Confidence in one athlete might mean calm focus. In another, it might mean underestimating the opponent. Aggression in one athlete might mean assertiveness. In another, it might mean recklessness. Anxiety in one athlete might mean readiness. In another, it might mean attentional collapse. So if the science only asks what happens on average, it risks missing the actual process, tell you the whole story. And often it does not tell you the story that matters most for coaching, training, and personal development. This brings us to another important point. There is no special version of science called sports psychology that gets to ignore the normal rules of scientific thinking. There is scientific inquiry, and there is the opposite of scientific inquiry. Science depends on systematic observation, evidence, and the possibility of being wrong. If an idea cannot be tested, or if someone holds the idea so rigidly that no evidence could ever change it, then the idea has become dogma. Combat sports are full of strong beliefs. Some of them are useful, some of them come from coaching experience, some of them are simply wrong. The goal of science is not to disrespect tradition. The goal is to make useful ideas more precise. If a coach says this athlete needs to control their emotions, science asks, which emotion? At what moment? How is it measured? Does it affect attention, breathing, decision-making, or movement selection? Does the same thing happen for all athletes or only for this athlete? That is what science does. It takes broad labels and tries to uncover mechanisms. And in combat sports, mechanisms matter. Because when attention collapses, performance degrades immediately. When arousal is too high, the athlete burns energy. When pain becomes threatening, the athlete panics. When emotion is regulated, performance stabilizes. So the purpose is not to replace coaching wisdom, the purpose is to sharpen it. A simple metaphor helps here. Traditional measurement is like a photograph. It captures a moment that can be valuable. A photograph can show posture, facial expression, body position, sweat, exhaustion. But a photograph cannot show trajectory. If you look at a photo of a boxer mid-punch, you do not know if the punch landed. You do not know if it was a setup. You do not know if the boxer was about to get countered. You do not know if the athlete was fresh or exhausted. You need the movie. The same is true psychologically. A one-time survey gives a picture. But if you want to study emotional dynamics, stress recovery, confidence, pain tolerance, or regulation, you need repeated measurement. You need to see how the system moves. This is where intensive longitudinal measurement becomes important. Instead of asking someone one big survey question, you measure them repeatedly over time, maybe multiple times a day, maybe before and after training, maybe during a competition camp, maybe across several weeks. This allows the scientist to study the movie of emotional life. And when you do that, something becomes obvious. People are very different from each other. Each person has their own emotional rhythm. The average often describes no one perfectly.
Now, even with the limitations of snapshot research, existing studies still tell us important things. Let's start with pain. Pain is part of combat sports. That does not mean every training session should be reckless or unsafe, but discomfort is built into the activity. Someone puts pressure on you. Someone controls your breathing. Someone bends your posture. Someone makes gripping painful. Or the training itself is painful because of fatigue, soreness, pressure, and repeated effort. So one major psychological skill in combat sports is learning how to relate to pain. Not simply tolerating pain, relating to it. Research suggests that combat sports athletes develop better pain management strategies. Some strategies are cognitive. For example, distraction. You shift attention away from the pain and toward tactics, breathing, movement, or the next action. Another strategy is reinterpretation. Instead of thinking, this pain means something is wrong, the athlete learns to think, this discomfort is part of the work. I can stay calm here. Arousal control also matters. Breathing, self-talk, and relaxation can reduce panic long enough to make a better decision. Any grappler knows this feeling. You are stuck under pressure. You want to explode. You want out immediately. But if you panic, you waste energy and make the position worse. The skill is not to pretend the discomfort is not real. The skill is to remain organized while discomfort is real. That is psychological training. And beginners often struggle because pain feels huge to them. Most people do not experience physical discomfort as a normal part of daily life unless something is wrong. So when they start training, normal combat sport discomfort can feel threatening. Over time, the athlete learns a new interpretation. This is uncomfortable, but I am not in danger. That distinction is powerful. Now let's talk about aggression. This is where combat sports often surprise people. From the outside, people assume that martial arts and combat sports make people more aggressive, but research often shows a more interesting pattern. Trained athletes may show better pain management, lower anxiety, and in some studies, lower hostility and lower uncontrolled physical aggression than non-athletes. That does not mean combat sports remove aggression, and honestly, that would not even make sense. A fighter needs assertiveness. A competitor needs the ability to move forward, impose pressure, and act decisively. The goal is not to erase aggression. The goal is regulation. This is something many people in Brazil know intuitively. When a child was very aggressive at school, a common recommendation was, put the child in Judo. The idea was not, let the child become more violent. The idea was that Judo would teach structure, respect, discipline, consequences, and self-control. The educational aspect of martial arts is central here. Training gives aggression a container. It teaches when to use force, how to use force, and when to stop. This is one of the most important psychological lessons in combat sports. The point is not that the athlete becomes harmless. The point is that the athlete becomes more controlled. A recent pattern in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu research fits this idea well. More experienced athletes often show higher mental strength, resilience, self-efficacy, self-control, and life satisfaction compared with beginners, without necessarily showing a simple decrease in aggression. That is important. The capacity for aggression may remain available, but the ability to control when and how it is expressed improves. This is why the popular question, do martial arts make people more aggressive or less aggressive, is too simple. A better question is, do martial arts change the regulation of aggression? And the answer seems to be yes. Now, aggression and emotion become even more interesting when looking at competition. Certain emotional states can support performance. This is where the simple advice, just stay calm, can be misleading. Calm is not always optimal. Combat sports require activation. The athlete needs energy. The athlete needs readiness. The athlete needs enough arousal to act quickly and decisively. There is an old principle in psychology called the Yerkes-Dodson law. The basic idea is that performance often improves with arousal up to a point, but after that point, too much arousal hurts performance. So the goal is not zero stress. The goal is the right level of stress. Research with Judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes has found that certain mood states before competition predict success. Moderate anger can increase winning probability. Tension can also be associated with better performance. Lower depression and lower fatigue are also important. This matches practical experience. Before competition, an athlete usually should not be completely flat. They need activation. They need intensity. They need some controlled aggression. But this is very different from emotional chaos. The best state is not uncontrolled rage. It is directed energy. A competitor who is too calm may lack intensity. A competitor who is too anxious may freeze. A competitor who is too angry may overcommit. The sweet spot depends on the athlete, the sport, the level of competition, and the moment. That is why coaches talk about peaking. The athlete is trying to arrive at the right psychological and physiological state at the right time. More recent research also suggests that what happens after competition may be more informative than what happens before. Winners and losers can look emotionally similar before a fight. Both can be anxious, both can be excited, both can feel anger, but after the fight, emotional trajectories may differ. Winners may show increases in excitement and joy. Losers may show different patterns of sadness, anger, and recovery. This suggests that emotional regulation may matter more than simply starting in the right state. In other words, the question is not only, how do you feel before the fight? The deeper question is, how does your emotional system move through the fight and recover afterward? That is the movie again.
One of the most fascinating parts of combat sports is learning to read people. At first, beginners see techniques, a punch, a takedown, a grip, a pass. But with experience, athletes start seeing intentions. They see the movement before the movement. They notice posture, breathing, tension, eye contact, rhythm, weight shifts, hesitation, and emotional expression. A good fighter is not just reacting to what happened. A good fighter is predicting what is about to happen. In traditional martial arts, people sometimes describe this as reading energy or reading ki. But scientifically, there is no need to invoke a mysterious, vital energy. A better explanation is that trained athletes learn to perceive subtle cues. They read the body, they read emotion, they read context. They integrate all of that information into prediction. Recent research comparing combat sport athletes with other groups suggests that action anticipation and emotion recognition are connected in combat athletes. In other words, the ability to recognize emotional cues may help the athlete anticipate movement. This is extremely important. It suggests that fighters are not only reading biomechanics, they are reading people. Think about self-defense. People often say, "Trust your intuition." That can sound vague, but intuition is often the body detecting cues before conscious awareness can explain them. Maybe someone's voice tone changes. Maybe their breathing changes. Maybe their posture shifts. Maybe their distance management becomes unusual. Maybe their face shows a flash of emotion. You may not be able to verbalize all of it, but your body starts preparing. That is not mild stress. That is a full physiological mobilization. The body is preparing for action. Heart rate rises. The sympathetic nervous system activates. Stress hormones and enzymes shift across time. And importantly, these biological systems do not all move at the same speed. Some responses happen before the match. Some peak immediately after, some peak later. Some recover within 90 minutes. This is another reason snapshots are limited. If you measure cortisol too early, you may miss the peak. If you measure mood only before competition, you may miss the crash or the recovery. If you measure only after the match, you may confuse physical exhaustion with emotional distress. The body has timing. The mind has timing. The two are coupled, but not identical. This is especially important for beginners. Research with novice combat athletes suggests that cognitive anxiety and physiological stress markers are connected. For someone competing for the first time, the body may not yet know how to calibrate the situation. The athlete experiences the competition as a major threat. The stress response is not yet trained. Veterans often look calmer not because they feel nothing, but because their system has learned the rhythm. They know what the sensations mean. They know the adrenaline spike is temporary. They know the body can recover. They have been there before. This is one reason combat sports may function as stress inoculation. Repeated exposure to controlled stress can teach the system how to activate, perform, and recover. The goal is not to eliminate stress. The goal is to reorganize the stress response.
So what does all of this suggest? Combat sports training seems to reshape emotional experience. It teaches people to tolerate discomfort without panic. It can reduce anxiety. It can improve self-control. It can help channel aggression. It can sharpen perception. It can train people to read emotional and motor cues in real time. And it can expose people to stress in a structured environment where activation, performance, and recovery repeat over time. But the key point is this: combat sports do not simply make people tougher in a vague way. They change the dynamics of regulation. They change how people move through states. A beginner feels pressure and panics. An experienced athlete feels pressure and starts solving. A beginner feels pain and interprets it as danger. An experienced athlete feels pain and asks, "Is this injury or is this discomfort?" A beginner feels anger and loses structure. An experienced athlete can convert anger into forward pressure without losing decision-making. That is the psychology of combat sports, not the absence of emotion, the organization of emotion. The next step for the science is clear. Combat sports psychology needs to move from snapshots to movies. Instead of measuring athletes once before competition and once after, researchers should measure psychological states repeatedly across real life. Before training, after training, later that night, the next morning, across weeks, across competition camps, across belt levels, across injuries and recoveries. This is what experience sampling and intensive longitudinal methods can do. They allow researchers to study the rhythm of the athlete's psychological life. And when that happens, the science becomes much more useful. Instead of saying, on average, athletes are less anxious, the scientists can ask, when does this athlete become anxious? How long does it last? What predicts recovery? Does hard sparring improve mood or disrupt sleep? Does losing in training produce learning or rumination? Does competition anxiety decrease with experience? Or does the athlete simply recover faster? Does anger help this athlete or hurt this athlete? Those are better questions. Those are process questions. And process questions are exactly what combat sports require. This scientific view also changes how we interpret failure. A fighter who freezes under pressure is not weak. They are experiencing attentional overload. A fighter who gasses out early is not simply lazy. They may be mismanaging arousal, breathing, pacing, or energy. A fighter who becomes too emotional is not morally flawed. Their regulation system is being pushed beyond its current capacity. That distinction matters, because moral judgment does not teach much. Mechanism teaches. If the problem is attentional overload, training can create narrower decision rules. If the problem is panic under pressure, training can use gradual exposure. If the problem is overactivation, breathing and pacing can be trained. If the problem is rumination after mistakes, reflection can be structured. Science turns vague criticism into targeted intervention. That is why this matters. Not just for researchers, for coaches, for athletes, for parents, for people using martial arts as a path towards self-control.
The psychology of combat sports is not just about being fearless. It is not just about being tough. It is not just about aggression, confidence, or discipline. Those words are too broad. The deeper question is how stress reorganizes perception and action, how pain changes attention, how emotion affects decision-making, how training changes the body's interpretation of discomfort, how athletes learn to read intention before action, and how repeated exposure to controlled adversity changes the dynamics of the mind. That is why combat sports are scientifically fascinating. They put the human system under pressure, and under pressure, the hidden mechanisms become visible. Not perfectly visible, not with a single snapshot, but visible enough if we build the right methods. The future of combat sports psychology is not just asking athletes how they feel before and after competition. The future is mapping the movie. The moving, changing, emotional, physiological, perceptual, social movie of the athlete. Because that is where the real psychology is. If this way of thinking about combat sports makes sense to you, leave a comment with one question you would want science to answer about training, competition, or psychological development in martial arts. And if you want more videos connecting psychology, science, and combat sports, subscribe to the channel. In the next videos, we'll go deeper into arousal, pain, aggression, coping, and resilience, not as motivational cliches, but as mechanisms that shape performance and development.